and welcome to another video. Today it is part 3 of the Vogue 9357 sew along. We're going to be finishing off the bodice and we're going to be putting the dress together and getting everything nicely finished. So let's get started. I have my outer bodice pinned to my lining all the way around the neckline. I'm actually going to stop my stitching about an inch away from the edge, this edge here, so that I can put my zipper in between the lining and the outer shell a little bit later, and I will close that up a little bit later. So I'm going to stitch all the way around here at 5/8 of an inch. I'm only going to do the neckline at the moment because I want to grade the seam, clip the curves and then understitch it, and that will be very much easier to do if I haven't sewn up the armholes. So I'm going to sew a 5/8 of an inch around the neckline. I've notched my seam allowance all around the curved neckline, and then with all of the seam allowance towards the lining I have understitched very close, sort of an 1/8 of an inch, a 1/16 of an inch away from my stitching line, making sure that I'm catching all of the seam allowance towards the lining of the dress, and this will just help to keep the lining rolled to the inside. So I'm now going to go and press this, and I'm going to press it with the lining side up so that I can make sure that the lining is rolling to the inside. I have notched my neckline, I've understitched it, so I now have put the bodice and lining right sides together again, and I've pinned up the armholes. You can just notice here that I have offset the lining by about an 1/8 of an inch, so there's 1/8 of an inch on the lining poking through, and I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch, and that little bit that we've got offset there will help that, again, help the lining to roll towards the inside. So I'm going to sew from underarm to underarm around both of these armholes at 5/8 of an inch. Now that I've sewn both of the armholes shut at 5/8 of an inch, I am going to use my pinking shears to grade off the seam allowance and also just notch around these curves. It's going to help it to lie nice and flatly, so I'm going to do that around both armholes. Okay, so I have clipped and notched my edges with my pinking shears, and now we get to turn the bodice through. So you're going to reach through the shoulder seam from the front bodice and you're going to pull through the back bodice, and you're going to do that on both sides. And then we can go and press the armholes that we have just sewn. So the armholes are nicely finished and just need pressing, so I'm going to go do that now. I'm pressing from the lining side, and I'm pressing so that I can just see the outer bodice rolling towards the inside. That was the point in us sewing the lining bodice an 1/8 of an inch offset. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to press from the lining side all the way around the armholes so I can just see the outer bodice rolling in. Okay, now we get to sew up our side seams. So I have got, this is our front bodice, and I have got the right sides together matching up at the underarm seam, and then this is the lining, so that's matched up to the waist seam as well. So we're going to stitch that at 5/8 of an inch the whole way down, and we're going to do that on both sides. Side seams are sewn, so I'm going to go and press these open, and then I'm going to press the underarm seam so that lies nice and flatly. Then our bodice is done. So having made my lemon dress, halfway through I put the whole thing together and decided I didn't like the midriff panels, so I have omitted those from the second dress that I'm making, which I am showing you. The rest of the sew along is going to be with the second dress. So all of these steps here we can ignore because we are not going to be adding our midriff panels. We've already finished our armholes and we're not adding the sleeves, so we can skip these steps and all of these steps. I have my bodice lining and my bodice completely together, the side seams sewn up, the armholes sewn up, the neck is sewn up. So the first thing that I've done with the bodice lining is I have pressed my hem or my waist seam up by 5/8 of an inch so that I can slip stitch this into place later. So the next step is step 30. Pin lower edge of midriff matching side seams, keeping midriff lining free, stitch press seam towards midriff. So we're actually going to be sewing the lower edge of our bodice to the upper edge of our skirt. We are going to be keeping our linings free. I've pinned my skirt to my bodice. I've matched up the center point, the notches. The notches on the skirt match up with the princess seam on the bodice. Matched up my side seams and my back seam, and I have just pinned everything in place. I am very pleased to report that everything fits in perfectly, having done all those calculations and measurements at the pattern making stage. It's really nice when this kind of thing happens. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the bodice. Okay, so now that we have attached the skirt to the bodice, we can sew down the trim, because I want the trim to go the entire way down the front of the bodice. So I am going to stitch very close to the edge of the trim all the way down, and I'm going to do that for both sides, and I'm going to keep the middle of the trim on the center seam. So the next thing to do is install the zip. I'm using a very long zip because I only have one black invisible zipper in my stash, and it is one of my 30-inch long ones. This is not the worst thing in the world for me, because this dress has such a high back and high neck at the back. It does mean that with this really long zip, I will still be able to step in and out of it rather than having to take it over my head. Now that we have our skirt attached to our bodice, we need to attach our zip. You remember that we left about an inch of our neck opening unstitched so that we could put our zip in. So I have the zigzagged edge of the zip up against the raw edge of the neckline, and I've sewn my zip in so that the coil is 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. Now I've shut my zip so that I can mark in on the free side where the waistband is, and this is the point that we need to match. And I'm using my invisible zipper foot to sew this on. So I'm going to unzip this, put the zip onto the other back opening without twisting the zip, ask me how I know, and get that sewn in place. My invisible zip is in, my waistband is matching up. I mean, it's off by about 1 millimeter, but I am going to live with that. Now that we have got the zip in, we need to finish up our neckline so that we can sew the lining to the zipper teeth and finish off that edge. So I'm going to get the neckline finished, and then we can do lining. I've pinned my bodice to my lining, sandwiching the zipper in between, and I'm going to just finish off this line of stitching here at 5/8 of an inch right to this edge, and I'm going to back stitch at the start and at the end, and I'm going to do that for both sides. We have our zip nicely sandwiched between our lining and our main fabric, and then I have just continued the understitching along to the end, making sure to stitch the seam allowance to the lining. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to finish the edge of our bodice. So we're going to pin the lining side to the zipper side, and we're going to sew that down so that it's all nice and cleanly finished on the inside. I have pinned my lining, which you can just see poking out there, to my main bodice, and again we're sandwiching the zip. I have got the understitching rolled to the lining side there, and I've pinned it all the way down to the waist, and I've made sure that the pressed back part of the waist seam is level with the sewn waist seam. So I'm going to sew this 1/4 of an inch away from the original line of stitching with the zipper teeth, and that's why we've offset this, because we're not sewing it at 5/8 of an inch. Again, we're sewing it slightly further in. We need to offset this so that the lining will fit into our bodice once we're finished. So I'm going to use my regular zipper foot, and I'm going to sew this at 1/4 of an inch away from the zipper teeth. I have my regular zipper foot on. I have my needle over to the left towards the teeth, but it's not as far over as it will go. I'm running the edge of my zipper foot against the coils of the zip, which is in there, and then I'm stitching about 1/4 of an inch away from that original line of stitching to secure this in place. Once you've finished sewing that into place, what you want to do is you want to turn it through to make sure that you're happy with where everything is sitting, and I am. And then once you've made sure that you're happy with everything, you then need to trim off the excess from the corner. So just reduce the bulk there, and then you can turn it through properly and press it, and I'm going to do the same for the other side. Okay, so now that we have our zipper in, we need to close up the bottom of our back center seam. So I have pinned everything together and I have my regular zipper foot on and my needle moved all the way over to the right. Now we're not going to be able to get right up to the stitching of our zip, but what we want to do is overlap by about 1/2 inch and get as close as we possibly can to our stitching. We're going to back stitch there and then stitch all the way down to the hem at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so you can see here I've overlapped the stitching from the zipper by about 1/2 inch and I've gotten as close as I can. I've back stitched there and then I've stitched all the way down to the hem. So I'm now going to go and press this open and lightly press the zip from the right side as well. Okay, we can ignore these steps from 33 onwards because we have already finished our neckline, because we have lined it. So we're going to move on to hemming and finishing the dress. Now I have put trim down the front of mine instead of the buttons, and I have sewn my zip so that it goes right up to the top, so I don't need a hook and eye. So I just need to hem it. I'm going to do that with bias binding. This will probably come as no surprise to any of you, but I'm going to finish my hem with bias binding. So I'm sewing the right side of the binding to the right side of the dress, and I'm matching up the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the skirt, and then I am sewing in the ditch of the binding. I'm going to do that the whole way round. When I started sewing my bias binding on, I folded back about 1 inch of the binding so that when I came to the end, which I'm very nearly going to do, I can overlap by about 1 inch again and sew into the ditch and then cut that off, and it just means that I'll have a nicely finished edge when I turn my binding around to the wrong side of the skirt to hem it. Okay, so I have pressed my bias binding round to the wrong side and I've left about I've made it so that there's about 1/8 of an inch of the outer fabric showing. So I'm now going to slip stitch this in place. So we have a final few things to do before our dress is finished. The first is to pin our bodice lining. You want to make sure that you're getting the fold of the seam allowance of the lining up against the stitching line of the outer seam, and we're going to slip stitch that into place. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I will see you again very soon. Bye!